RimWorld is not a video game. That was the mantra solo developer Tynan Sylvester repeated to himself during development. RimWorld is a story generator, a complex machine built to create unpredictable, emotionally charged narratives that emerge from your decisions as you manage a colony on a distant planet. There are no cutscenes, no scripted missions. The characters are barely animated figures sliding across a 2D grid. And yet, inside this minimalist simulation, players witness love, betrayal, addiction, and redemption. Colonists play poker, get kidnapped by space pirates, suffer severe injuries, and risk everything to save each other. Every playthrough is different. Every moment is a chance for something extraordinary to happen, not because it was scripted, but because the player made it happen. So how did Tynan pull this off? How do you build an interactive experience that doesn't tell stories, but generates them? And what kind of mindset does it take to make something like that, mostly alone? This is the story behind RimWorld. RimWorld didn't come from a sudden moment of inspiration. It's the product of a lifelong compulsion. Tynan grew up in Richmond Hill, Ontario, and from an early age he was obsessed with how complex things worked. When his older brother brought home a copy of MechWarrior, he was instantly hooked. Not just on playing the game, but on the machinery behind it. He'd spend hours sketching battle mechs, complete with exposed wiring and cutaway diagrams of armor plating. He wasn't just imagining the robot, he was imagining the system that made the robot work. Whenever his mom told him to stop playing the NES and go outside, he'd grab some chalk and start sketching game levels on the driveway. In middle school, he got his hands on the Unreal Tournament level editor, but struggled to make anything functional at that age. He even recalls not knowing how to move the brush in the Unreal editor, and briefly considered emailing Gears of War creator Cliff Bleszinski for help, before deciding he was too shy to actually do it. This was Tynan's phase of self-teaching. With no mentor, no roadmap, and no formal training, he taught himself the basics of game design. It felt less like a hobby and more like a calling. It's hard to say what attracted me to game design because I can't remember a time when I wasn't doing it. Ideas come automatically, unbidden, and build up a sort of psychic pressure inside. Expressing them as games is a release, and the satisfaction of creating things keeps me sane. I guess you could say I was attracted to game design the same way I'm attracted to breathing, non-optional. By 2003, he entered one of his homemade Unreal Tournament maps into the Fragapalooza design contest. Tynan's map won first place, and Cliff Bleszinski himself gave it the Ownage Award. It seemed obvious Tynan was headed for a career in games. But before he became an indie developer, his first video game job took him in the complete opposite direction. He landed what many aspiring game developers would consider a dream job at the time, joining Irrational Games to work on BioShock Infinite, one of the most anticipated titles of its time. But the reality of AAA development didn't match the fantasy. His time at Irrational was defined less by creative satisfaction and more by the frustrations of large team production. Entire weeks of work could vanish overnight due to high-level decisions beyond his control. The experience made something painfully clear. This wasn't how he wanted to make games. What he enjoyed most was tackling unstructured problems, untangling overlapping systems, and debugging thousands of tiny issues until everything clicked. And perhaps most of all, he realized he works best solo rather than in a giant AAA office. In February 2012, Tynan quit. He walked away from a major studio, steady pay, and a high-profile project before the game even shipped, and started fresh with his own game development company, Ludian Studios. He had no team, no funding, and no clear idea of what kind of game he was going to make. However, he did know he had to fail several times first before he would come up with the idea. That mindset allowed him to rapidly develop prototypes, throw out anything that wasn't working, and keep experimenting until he landed on RimWorld. One of his first ideas was a zombie roguelike RPG. It initially looked promising, but Tynan felt it lost its appeal after just a month of playtesting. Then came Warlock TV, a real-time arena brawler with tower defense elements, where magician gladiators fought for prize money. He also tried a mercenary management sim, something like Football Manager crossed with Hitman, where you didn't play the assassin, but instead you ran the team that sends him on missions. There was also a magical university simulator titled Animus. Most of these projects were scrapped within weeks. Some had a decent hook, but just weren't fun. Others were too ambitious, too scattered, or just too strange to pin down. While this process of rapidly iterating on prototypes might sound straightforward, it was the most psychologically brutal and creatively important phase of Tynan's career. The hardest part was knowing when to quit. He constantly wrestled with the question, if I polish this one more, will it get fun? Scrapping an idea could save precious time, but it might also mean throwing away something that could have been great. And because most prototypes were just gray boxes and abstract shapes, it was hard to tell if there was something worthwhile buried in the mess. But despite the uncertainty and the fact that he was living off savings with no real safety net, he kept going. He trusted the process. The prototype that would eventually become RimWorld didn't start on a planet. It started in space. Built in Unity, Tynan called it Starship Architect, and the idea was to let players design a spaceship, travel across the galaxy, and engage in real-time battles. You'd lay out the ship's interior, assign crew members, and fend off boarding parties while managing life support, power flow, and internal logistics. It had potential, but something felt off. The two main pillars, flying the ship through space and managing its interior, just didn't mesh. Instead of scrapping the whole thing, he stripped away the starship and moved the characters to the surface of a planet. Now, instead of commanding a crew in deep space, players would manage a group of colonists stranded on an alien world. Suddenly, things started to click. After renaming the game to Eclipse Colony and implementing a few more mechanics and systems, Tynan invited some friends over to playtest it. I already felt like I was stronger than my other prototypes. The characters were still little yellow dots, and few game systems were in, but I had two of my friends over to play it, and they just zoned into it for like 3 hours. They came in the evening and were still there at 1 AM. They wouldn't leave my house. That's when I knew it was going to work. Eclipse Colony wasn't just the most promising prototype he'd built so far, it was the first one that sparked real emotional engagement. Unlike his earlier experiments, it didn't feel like a collection of systems, it felt like a story slowly unfolding. He hadn't fully articulated his design philosophy yet, but the seed of RimWorld's most important idea had been planted. This wasn't going to be a game, it was going to be a story generator. And that distinction was something he had to remind himself of constantly during development, until it became a mantra. Eclipse Colony was later renamed RimWorld. Tynan felt the name better captured the game's frontier spirit, and its focus on survival at civilization's edge. While expanding on RimWorld, Tynan drew inspiration from all kinds of movies, books, and games. Dune, Firefly, The Dark Tower, Starship Troopers, Doom, RimWorld, and Warhammer 40k all fed into the game's DNA. The biggest narrative influence, though, came from the book Story by Robert McKee, a legendary screenwriting lecturer whose workshops have shaped how Hollywood writers think about storytelling for decades. McKee's core lesson isn't about crafting elaborate plots, it's about putting characters under pressure and seeing how they respond. Tynan also pulled from real life. As a kid, he went on camping trips with his family into the Canadian wilderness, where foraging for berries and enduring harsh weather wasn't all that different from what players might face on an alien world. The greatest source of inspiration by far was Dwarf Fortress. However, Tynan wasn't inspired by playing it, he was inspired by the way people talked about it. He was captivated by the emergent stories players created, embellished, and shared. Epic tales of dwarves going mad, volcanoes erupting in the middle of a feast, and fortresses collapsing into glorious chaos. These stories didn't come from cutscenes or scripted quests, they came from systems colliding in unpredictable ways. What fascinated Tynan wasn't just that Dwarf Fortress was complex, it was that its complexity gave birth to emotion. And that was exactly the kind of emotion he wanted to inject into RimWorld. That realization gave him the focus he needed to define the experience his project was trying to deliver, not just what the mechanics would be, but how players were supposed to feel. Tynan didn't want players to win or lose in the traditional sense. He wanted them to experience something emotional, unpredictable, and personal. And to build a system that could do that, he would have to break a lot of the assumptions baked into traditional game design. One of the first things Tynan set out to dismantle was what he calls the skill test assumption, the idea that skill should always be rewarded proportionally. In most games, the better you are, the more likely you are to win and rack up increasingly better rewards. That makes sense when a game's purpose is to test the player's skill. But remember, RimWorld isn't a game, it's a story generator. And in a good story, tension doesn't come from winning or losing, it comes from threatening the things the characters care about. In Tynan's world, hurts. Stories can end in success or failure and still be great stories. Every tragedy story ends in horrifying failure and loss for the protagonist, but those tragedies are rich and moving emotional experiences. RimWorld follows that rule. When something goes wrong, it's rarely the end of the experience. It's the loss of something meaningful. A beloved pet, a colonist spouse, the doctor who kept everyone alive through 4 cruel winters. The story doesn't stop, it just changes direction. And because the player is invested in these people, those losses hit harder than any game over screen ever could. To make this work, Tynan built the experience around what he calls elastic failure. In most games, failure means reloading your last checkpoint and trying again. In RimWorld, failure bends instead of breaks. Raiders might not wipe out your entire colony. They might kidnap someone, steal your silver, and leave. You don't need to reload your save. You adapt, you rebuild. Or if things go really bad, the player can even flee their base in a caravan and go somewhere else. Tynan deliberately structured the story generator so players could recover from disasters and carry the emotional weight with them. Colonists don't just die, they're remembered. Friends mourn them. Their absence changes how others behave. It's not failure, it's the next chapter in the story. Most developers think about graphics in terms of detail and realism. How good does it look? How clearly does it communicate gameplay? Those are generally good criteria for a video game, but not for a story generator. And to communicate a story, the visuals don't need to be detailed, beautiful, or realistic. After all, a story isn't a sequence of images, it's a sequence of events. When you read a novel, your mind fills in the situations, characters, and emotions. Without a single picture, you can still feel the story. That's why Tynan approached RimWorld's visuals as a system of symbols. Their job isn't to dazzle the eyes, it's to transmit a story into the player's mind. And in that sense, the graphics are only as important as a font in a novel. At the core of this approach is a psychological phenomenon called apophenia, our brain's built-in tendency to find meaning in incomplete patterns. It's why we see faces in clouds, animals in constellations, or attribute emotions to rocks. The human mind is constantly searching for intent, personality, and story, even in lifeless objects. Tynan leaned into this by deliberately keeping the visuals simple. They shouldn't be unpleasant to look at, of course, but leaving out things like facial expressions and body language actually improve the player's emotional connection to their colony. The characters don't need to be expressive if the player understands the context. Imagine a colonist treating his wife, who just lost a leg in a raider attack. No animation or extra detail could make that moment more powerful than the player's own imagination. The ambiguity invites interpretation, and that interpretation makes the story personal. RimWorld's art style wasn't just about psychology, it was also about clarity. Simple, easily identifiable visuals reduce noise on the screen and make it easier to understand what's happening. Detailed, beautiful art might look great in isolation, but in a game like RimWorld, with hundreds of objects on screen at once, too much detail makes scanning the scene very difficult. The flat-shaded top-down sprites are easy to identify. Colonists and buildings have thick black outlines, while plants have dark green outlines, or none at all, so they fade slightly into the background. This creates an intensity hierarchy, a subtle visual ranking of what's most important on screen. Even in the chaos of a raid or wildfire, your attention naturally goes to the colonists first. There was also a practical side to keeping the graphics simple: speed. Without the burden of detailed animations or flashy art, Tynan could pour his time into adding new mechanics and events that made the story generator richer, stranger, and more complex. Every hour not spent animating a walk cycle was an hour spent making the simulation deeper. And in RimWorld, the depth of events, not the beauty of the visuals, was the real selling point. Tynan did experiment with styles that had more detail and complex animations, but every time the result felt wrong. It reduced clarity and slowed down development. Perhaps the most elegant aspect of RimWorld's art style, and its overall design, is that it can create the illusion of complexity without the developer having to build it at all. If a player imagines a relationship between two colonists, or senses tension in the air during a siege, that's emotional depth that costs zero development time. Tynan calls this impossible game design, when the game doesn't explicitly simulate something, but the player perceives it anyway. By avoiding a forced interpretation, the game invites players to project their own, and once a player feels ownership over the meaning of an event, the story becomes theirs. That's why RimWorld's minimal visuals aren't a weakness, they're the scaffolding on which every unforgettable player's story is built. During development, Tynan received a lot of suggestions for new features, things like weapon customization, advanced fluid simulations, or complex crop genetics. Even today, 7 years after RimWorld's release, players still ask for deeper customization and more advanced management systems. For many developers, these "wouldn't it be cool if" ideas are hard to resist. They're mechanically interesting, technically challenging, and satisfying to build. Tynan felt the same temptation, but he learned to resist it, because RimWorld was never about building the most detailed simulation possible. It's about creating the most emotionally resonant simulation possible. A plant breeding mechanic might be fascinating from a systems perspective, but if it doesn't change how colonists feel or how players feel about them, it doesn't belong in RimWorld. To keep himself disciplined, Tynan developed a system for deciding what to work on next. The first rule is simple: never ask, "Would this be cool to add?" That's too easy to say yes to and too dangerous. The real question is harder. Of every possible idea, what would add the most value per cost? Every feature, every piece of art, every tweak in the code has a cost. Hours of labor, days of testing, weeks of debugging. Therefore, it's crucial developers select the right task for the right time. Comparing potentially hundreds of ideas isn't easy, but to make it manageable, Tynan built the Idea Reservoir, a massive living document containing every single idea he's ever had for RimWorld. Big or small, good or bad, it doesn't matter. Nothing gets thrown out, because a bad idea today might be perfect 6 months later. From there, ideas are ranked by value per cost, with the best ones moving to a short-term to-do list, a small focus list of tasks for the next week or two. Every so often, he revisits the entire reservoir, re-ranking ideas based on the current state of development. What was best in January might not be best in March. When the short-term list runs low, the highest-ranked ideas from the reservoir are moved to the short-term list. It creates a constant survival of the fittest battle between ideas. Nothing is added just because it's new or because it sounded cool. If it made it into RimWorld, it was because it beat every other idea for player impact versus development effort. Tynan also had to ask himself, is it possible to ship my project without this feature? It's something he advises other developers to do as well. The first paid version of RimWorld had no animations, and according to Tynan, not a single player complained about it. Early on, there was no system for traders to physically walk into your colony. Instead, players traded through a comms console with passing ships, which served the same gameplay purpose without weeks of extra work. These decisions weren't about laziness, they were about focus. If a feature didn't directly enrich the game's emotional core, it wasn't worth the cost. By mid-2013, RimWorld had grown into something more substantial. It now had characters with needs and moods, 3 AI storytellers that could throw dynamic events at players based on their gameplay preferences, and a handful of crude biomes to survive in. It still looked primitive, but the emotional hooks were already there. Up to this point, the project had been entirely self-funded, built in private with only occasional input from friends. But Tynan knew that if he wanted to keep working on it full-time and turn it into something more than a personal passion project, he needed outside funding. Crowdfunding was exploding at the time, and games like FTL and Wasteland 2 were proving that niche, system-heavy games could find huge success with direct community backing. So, in October 2013, Tynan took the leap and launched a Kickstarter with a modest goal of 20,000 Canadian dollars. It was obliterated in less than a day. By the time the campaign closed, backers had pledged over 268,000 Canadian dollars. It was clear players wanted exactly what RimWorld was offering. Not a fixed narrative, but a sandbox for drama, absurdity, and tragedy. Backers got access to every alpha build as it released, and Tynan kept the updates coming fast, often adding entire systems with each version. Alpha 2 in 2014 introduced farming, cooking, and smarter AI behaviors. Alpha 6 expanded the game with a world map, taking it beyond a single crash site. Alpha 8 brought a new weather and season system, forcing players to prepare for heat waves and blizzards. By 2015, Alpha 12 overhauled relationships and social interactions, laying the foundation deliver some of the game's most memorable emergent drama. The years between Kickstarter and Steam saw the RimWorld community blossom. Modding support was available from the earliest alphas, and players wasted no time adding new biomes, weapons, and events. Tynan embraced it, knowing mods could push the story generator far beyond what he could build alone. The official forums became a mix of development blog, player diaries, and modding hub. And with new builds arriving frequently, players kept coming back, not just for updates, but to see how their old colonies would fare under new rules. Behind the scenes, the team stayed deliberately small. Specialists joined only when needed. Artist Rapunzel helped define RimWorld's distinctive art style, and composer Alistair Lindsay created the atmospheric soundtrack that hums quietly in the background of every colony's rise and fall. In 2014, programmer Eisen came on board to help share the coding and design load. Tynan considered the idea of expanding the team further, but finding the right people proved difficult. I'd love to add more developers, but it's very hard to find skilled ones. I've evaluated a number of people, but none have really shown the combination of aptitudes I'm looking for. So the problem is finding people. Getting good game devs isn't a money issue, really. You can't buy them off the shelf like ordering something off Amazon. There's also the quality of life issue. Do I want to manage people or work on the game myself? A group of employees can really help make games, but they're a big responsibility and they can really reduce your freedom. By mid-2016, RimWorld had been in paid alpha for nearly 3 years, with a stable codebase, a thriving modding scene, and word-of-mouth buzz. Moving to Steam's early access program was less about funding development, it was about visibility. In July 2016, RimWorld launched on Steam Early Access. The Steam release massively expanded the audience, but crucially, the story generator didn't compromise its vision in the process. Tynan made it clear from the start, RimWorld wasn't going to chase flashy features or massive overhauls just because of Steam exposure. The same value per cost philosophy from the Kickstarter days would still guide every decision. When RimWorld hit version 1.0 in October 2018, it wasn't a radical reinvention of the early access version. Instead, 1.0 was a declaration that the foundation was complete, that the project had reached a point where it could stand as a finished product. The response was immediate and glowing. RimWorld quickly became one of the highest rated games on Steam, with 97% of all user reviews being overwhelmingly positive. Unlike most games, RimWorld didn't fade after launch. Its open-ended nature meant that every colony was a fresh narrative, and its mod support gave players infinite reasons to return. By 2019, it was regularly appearing in Steam's top played charts despite having no competitive or live service elements. The community became a storytelling culture in itself. Fans wrote illustrated colony journals, created comic strips, and produced YouTube series chronicling their survival attempts. Since 2020, RimWorld received 5 major expansions, each adding fuel to its story generator. The Royalty DLC brought quests, psychic powers, and nobility. Ideology let players shape belief systems, creating new conflicts and rituals. Biotech added children, family bonds, and genetic engineering. Anomaly pushed into horror with cults and infestations, while Odyssey expanded exploration with craft ships, exotic worlds, over 40 new creatures, and a reworked quest system. Through it all, every expansion was filtered through the same value per cost lens, and nothing was added that didn't feed the emotional engine. When Tynan first started on Eclipse Colony in 2012, he wasn't chasing mass market appeal. He was building a machine for stories the player would co-author, often without realizing it. Over a decade later, that machine is still running. Colonists still fall in love, lose limbs, survive impossible odds, and die in absurd accidents. Players still tell those stories online as if they happen to real people, and RimWorld still does what Tynan set out to do, make the player care about what happens next. He's proven something rare, that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones you write for the player, they're the ones the player writes for themselves.